All right, we're going to go ahead and get going. I'll keep logging people in, but I think the rush has slowed a little bit. Welcome all. I'm going to ask everybody to please mute. We are expecting by the end of it to be a fairly substantial attendance in the class, and having a lot of background noise can be detrimental. You may submit questions relevant to the immediate topic through the chat. That's fine. If you'd rather wait till the end, I'll give you opportunities to unmute and ask questions verbally at the end. We'll take whatever time it takes. If we get a lot of people on, sometimes it takes a while to get through them all. So we are here on a beautiful sunny Sunday morning in January, which is ideal pruning time and weather, to talk about pruning fruit trees. We'll talk very briefly about nut trees as well. I am also willing to field questions about other small fruit pruning at the end, but they're not really covered majorly in this presentation as such. So fruit tree pruning, and the relevant questions are, at first, why are we doing this? Don't trees grow? Don't we want them to grow? And why are we cutting at them? So fruit trees are intensively bred for specific fruit production. And so with that in mind, there are things that happen. Fruit trees get diseases, they have pest issues. Trees tend to be really vigorous, and sometimes they will be vigorous to the point it is detrimental to either your ability to manage the tree or the tree's ability to successfully ripen the amount of fruit it tries to set. So we are trying to control the size and the shape of the trees to make them more manageable, but we're also trying to prune the tree in such a way to maximize the productivity, which does not always mean maximizing the number of fruit set, but maintaining a balance between the fruit set and the ability of the tree to successfully mature that fruit without taking too much energy away from the parent tree. And that energy away from the parent tree is the issue when we're talking about maintaining vigor. And this becomes more relevant as trees become somewhat older. They often need to be rejuvenation pruned when their vigor is not sufficient to keep them refreshing enough new wood to keep producing, because it's not your really old barky trunk wood that produces the fruit. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to go through and check your mutes. We've got a lot of background noise. Check your mutes. We've got a lot of background noise.
Do what? What did he say?
About check your mute. There's a lot of background noise.
Make sure you mute it.
You mute it.
Make
All
sure
right.
what?
During when are we pruning?
When are we pruning?
I'm going to take a second here to mute.
I can't get the picture on the thingy.
Got the backgrounds. All right. So when do we prune? There are some growing conditions that will limit pruning. Generally speaking, we don't want to prune until the trees are really sufficiently dormant. If you prune them too early, you're going to have some bleeding. You may have some dieback issues. And in the Pacific Northwest, which is certainly not universal, there's differences in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. But in the Pacific Northwest, we are often not dormant, especially in some of the later trees like pears, until maybe the very end of November or very first part of December. We need to have had some really significantly cold weather to make sure the sap is down, because we risk damaging the trees if we're pruning too early. So that's kind of the one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, what is the cutoff, is usually about the time the buds are really expanding and beginning to get into production. For most fruit trees, that's sometime around February to March. A few of the later things go a bit later and can be run a little bit later. So that's kind of your window from dormancy, which is not the same as leaf drop, but leaf drop is a partial indicator, through the beginning of the new growth phase is when you want to do your dormant season pruning. That's when we do the bulk of pruning, because it's easy to see what you're doing and it's easy on the tree in that window of time. There are other times of the year we might do some pruning. We might do some follow-up pruning at the end of the vegetative growth cycle. So what happens with a tree is the buds that you see on the bare wood now are all last year's stored energy, well, flower buds and new growth buds. Our typical fruit trees, our plums like apples and pears, and our stone fruits like cherries and peaches will go through a cycle where they flower out, receive pollination, and begin to set the fruit. And at the end of their flowering cycle, or shortly after their flowering cycle, about the time the fruit is beginning to be formed, they'll push out new vegetative growth. This is no leaf growth, but also new branches coming out. They'll go through that new growth phase until we start really drying down and warming up late in the summer. So sometime in late June to early July, vegetative growth really grinds to a halt. The tree changes its hormone balance to finish ripening the fruit. And so if you do some pruning in the summer, you won't get the same responses from the tree as you do when the pruning is done in the winter. Okay, so for example, if you prune a plum tree right now, which you should be doing your plum pruning right now, it's going to respond with a thicket of new growth up in the crown, going all which way in the main branches of the tree, and it's also going to respond with suckers coming up from the root system. If you did that same amount of pruning or follow-up pruning to clean some of those issues up in late June, early July, it doesn't respond the same way because it doesn't have the right hormones to push vegetative growth. It's really focused on fruit ripening. There's some reasons we don't do all of that pruning in that season, and part of it is you want to be able to direct that new growth where you want it. But the other thing is it's harder on the tree to do substantial pruning in that summer cycle. There's more risks because of insects and diseases that are present during that period. You have fruit on the tree that you're trying to work around and not knock all your fruit off while you're pruning. And the tree itself has sap running, is more sensitive to bruising and other damage from slapping ladders in there and hitting branches against each other and that kind of thing. So some combination of the two seasons on mature trees is often beneficial, but we do try to do the bulk of our structural pruning in the winter and follow-up pruning or sometimes fruit thinning as well, much later in the season in the summer. So other aspects of timing your pruning. Weather conditions do impact pruning. Theoretically, you can prune in kind of drizzly wet weather. Pruning in really wet weather is not a good idea. You have to worry about slip issues on the ladders quite a bit when you're actually climbing into your trees to do pruning work. There are some risks to pruning during substantially wet weather. The biggest risk is wet weather combined with pruning can often lead to increased infection, disease infection. That moisture can help diseases spread. So we try to avoid pruning in the rain as much as possible. We don't lose a lot of sleep about it as long as we are reasonably safe. This is the Pacific Northwest. Finding enough days between December and March that you can both do the pruning you need to do and do the spraying you need to do in dry weather is sometimes challenging. So be as careful as you can about that, but rain is not as critical as freezing weather. You really shouldn't be doing pruning in freezing weather. Now, right at frost point, I'm not worried about what you're doing to the tree, but you get down into the 20s, those pruning cuts are going to create greater damage in severely cold weather and are going to heal slower in severely cold weather. So we would prefer you not to prune when we're in the 20s or so, and that includes that temperature upcoming immediately after pruning. So if you're pruning in the afternoon and you're forecast for a 20-degree night, it's really not ideal. If you can find a window where it's not quite so cold, be much better. But do not actually prune when the air temperature is below freezing. Very low temperatures, which is seldom a problem in the Northwest, but can be. Never do any substantial pruning below about 20 degrees. Wait until you've had a few days of warmer weather because you can do substantial damage to the trees by pruning in severely cold weather. It's one of the reasons other climates do more summer pruning than we do. They often don't necessarily have as many options in the winter as we do. So you're going to need some basic tools to get the job done. And hand pruners get used a little bit. On a young tree, they might get used a lot. On a mature tree, you're not going to be using a lot of your little one-hand hand pruners. You're going to spend a lot more time with loppers, the big two-hand pruners, or saws. Potentially, you might invest in an expandable and a telescoping pruner that has maybe a hook type lop, a hook type cutter on the top, and or maybe an attachment for a saw blade. Even a relatively small tree, a 12 to 15 foot tree, you're not going to do it standing on the ground unless you have extension tools. And working up and down ladders a lot is a real pain, though maybe not as much of a pain as looking straight up in the air and cutting with a pole saw. You have to make some decisions based on your physical abilities and your actual situation of your trees. Those expansion tools, those extending tools are useful, but are certainly not the only way to get there. Okay, I have a comment on that my slideshow is not moving. Can somebody verify for that for me? Is nobody seeing the slideshow progressing?
It's still stuck on Old Orchard Year 1.
Wow.
That's what it's been all
Okay.
along.
Thank you for letting me know. Let me just a moment get out of that and see if I can relaunch it. I'm not sure why that happened. There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that. I clicked the wrong share tab. Appreciate you letting me know. Okay. So, tools. Pole extenders can be useful. They're not essential. A ladder is often essential because even a relatively small tree is hard to get up into, and using pole tools, there's limits to your endurance usually. Gloves are definitely beneficial. It's not going to be pleasant weather out even under good conditions. And you need to keep your hands warm and functional. In addition, you're going to be working with sharp tools. You're going to be working with broken off branch stubs, things like that. And that can all impact your hands pretty significantly. So protect your hands, do use gloves. Rain gear can be beneficial if the weather is drippy. You're working under a tree that may be mossy, it has lots of branches. Every time you cut, it's going to be showering little raindrops down on you, even if it's not raining. If you're doing it in the morning, you've got any amount of dew at all, it's going to be substantially an issue for getting wet. Unless we have extended good weather like we've had a lot of this season. Sanitizer. So we're not talking COVID now. Sanitizer is your tools. While a lot of diseases spread easily by spores during advantageous weather conditions, a number of diseases can spread on your tools, your saws and your pruners. So it's a good idea to have the ability to sanitize your tools at least between trees, and on a very badly infected tree, you might want to sanitize between cuts. You've got a couple of different directions you can go for sanitation. 1 part of bleach and 6 parts of water does a really good job of cleaning and sterilizing tools. I tend to always have handy rubbing alcohol or isopropyl alcohol, and alcohol is a good sterilant for tools to clear up both bacterial and fungal diseases, which is what we're worrying about spreading. At request, I'm going to step back just a moment. We'll go through the slides so you guys can see the slides we missed. They're mostly text slides. So we're talking about, well, why are we pruning? To control diseases, limit size and control shape, increasing the fruit productivity, and maintaining good vigor. We are pruning during the dormant season primarily, after some substantial cold weather, and we are pruning before the new growth emerges in the spring. We want late season pruning is sometimes done for a variety of reasons, because the tree responds differently to summer pruning, and because we may need to do additional thinning, and we may need to do additional pruning that does not result in a lot of sucker growth or secondary growth that is not helpful. Can we prune in the rain? Yes, with some cautions, and in mild freezing conditions like around frost point. But be very careful about pruning in very low temperatures. Anything below about 20 degrees can be very damaging to prune the trees, whether that is a day after 18 or 19 degree weather or a day or two before 18 or 19 degree weather. Those can be damaging. Give it a couple of days of warmer weather in between. So back to active slide. We talked about sanitation. Courage. There's a combination of art and science to pruning a tree, and you can get by with a bit of one or a bit of the other, but you do have to physically get out there and do it and be bold. There is some definite hesitation on a lot of people who haven't done this to get out there and cut away. And when you start getting, especially refreshing an old orchard and you're cutting off a 3-inch diameter branch, it can be intimidating. You're worried about what you're doing to that tree, and which is a substantial investment. As long as you're following reasonable guidelines and you're actually getting out and doing the pruning, there's a lot of right ways you can do it and a few wrong but correctable ways. There's very few ways you can be disastrously wrong, and that's why you're attending a class like this, to avoid some of those. There are some great books on the topic. There's also some great web references. Oregon State University, the Extension Service, has great general pruning guides available free online. You can look at them. We like Pruning Made Easy by Lewis Hill, one of the top gardening books ever written on the topic. We use that for training our staff. We use that as a general reference for ourselves and our customers to answer questions. And when we were back in having these classes in person, we kept a few copies out for people to look at while we were going through. We're not a bookstore. We're not major booksellers. It is far and away the best-selling book at the Garden Center here, because it is a clear, well-spoken, and clearly illustrated guide to pruning. It does cover some ornamentals as well, but it's heavily focused on production fruit trees, grapes, small fruits, and it gives you some step-by-step. So if you wanted some follow-up beyond what we cover here, I do recommend that book. It is a solid book. You'll find throughout the presentation, I've got a few that are ink sketch diagrams of prunings, and those diagrams are from this book, like the one you see here on the bottom left. A few things about understanding the nomenclature of a tree, what we're labeling, what we're talking about when we're talking about the parts of the tree. So you obviously have the root system underground, which swells up to a kind of a swollen crown at ground level, and then you have a straight upright trunk. So this is your main structural element of the tree coming out of the ground. It can be of varying heights between the ground and the first major branch, but that main structural space that comes from the ground and supports the branches of the tree is the trunk. When we talk about a scaffold branch, when you're starting with a young tree, you're going to develop your scaffold branch. And your scaffold branches are your 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes as many as 5, depending on the size and type of tree, major production branches that come out from the main trunk. And so these become the skeleton of the tree, as it were, the arms and legs from which the active growth and production wood will come off of them. They're the structural support. And we'll talk a little bit, a couple of slides further about developing those in a young tree. So your scaffold branches are your major structural branches, and your secondary growth that comes off of that, the fingers that are coming out of the arms, as it were, are lateral branches. The lateral branches will have your actual vegetative growth, your shoot growth, and your leaves that do the photosynthesis. They will also have the fruit production parts, whether that's on the end of the branches for some fruits or on short spur branches on other types of fruit. So your lateral branches are your actively growing part of the tree with the new growth and the fruit, and your scaffold are the skeleton that holds them in place and gives them the place they can grow from. It is critical that you do a clean job of making good, appropriate cuts in the course of pruning. Okay, so to that end, we're going to talk about what a branch collar is, because that becomes a relevant topic for making good cuts, and the difference between making a thinning cut and a heading cut. So the branch collar is the swollen specialized tissue that occurs where one branch adjoins a main trunk or another branch. The picture here shows a little bit of branch collar, but the next picture is much better. If you look on that left-hand picture, you've got a lateral branch going from left to right, and right where that side branch comes out, you can see that kind of crinkly, swollen tissue that joins the smaller branch to the parent branch. That swollen tissue is a branch collar, and that branch collar has both support functions and the ability to heal really rapidly. So we want to keep that branch collar intact, and when we're pruning, we want to be careful not to prune into that branch collar. In other words, when we talk about making a flush cut against a branch, we're not actually making a flush cut against a branch. We're making a flush cut to the top of the branch collar. So that applies to thinning cuts, where you are actually removing an entire branch. You have a parent trunk or branch, you have a side branch, a lateral branch off of it, and you are removing the entire branch. That is a thinning cut, and that's where you will be cutting flush against the top of the branch collar. Heading cuts are different. Heading cuts are taking a branch and taking the end out of it. You do a thinning cut to open up the tree to reduce some of the volumetric wood out there that the tree is trying to produce. You do a heading cut primarily to limit growth, upwards in particular, and to direct branches to go in an outward direction. So typically when you're doing a heading cut, you will do a heading cut just above a lateral branch. Because what happens after you make that heading cut is the next bud, and even a couple of buds down below that, will suddenly get an influx of new energy as the sap rises. And so those will promote much more vigorous growth in those buds that you've left behind, and by limiting the amount of growth that could have gone on up there. So thinning to remove branches to open out, heading to give direction and control. And we'll show a couple of examples of those. So typical thinning cut is, as you see here, we're removing an entire branch because it's not where we want it, or it's unneeded, it's an excess amount of growth. And you can see on the right-hand picture, we have cut flush up against the top of the branch collar. And so that gives you the ability for that branch collar to rapidly grow around that cut mark and give you a good clean heel. A heading cut needs to leave a little bit of tissue past the growing point you're trying to encourage, because you're going to get a little bit of dieback. You may not get a perfectly clean heel. So we want to make our heading cuts on a slanted angle. Something in the neighborhood of a 45-degree angle is good. You don't want to make a flat cut. You don't want to make a hugely sharp angled cut to enable that tip dieback as the tree heals around it. You need to make sure that you're allowing enough space between that growing bud or branch and the cut. So a good general rule of thumb is 1/4 to a 1/2 inch past the growing bud you are trying to encourage. Make your slanted cut. The long end of the branch should be on the same side as the growth bud or branch you're trying to encourage. The back end of the slant should be on the opposite side and should still be 1/4 to a 1/2 inch from the back end. So if you're cut here, you're trying to encourage a growth here. You want to have your slant like this, but you need to have that back end be 1/4 to a 1/2 inch past that growing thing. And so that gives you an option for that little bit of dieback that happens after that top of cut, and to still maintain that bud and promote that growth going in that specific direction. If you prune too close, you can have dieback issues, or even with good sharp pruners and good techniques, sometimes there's a little bit of bark tear, and you can see that in my little cut there. I've got just a little tiny wing of stub where I got a little bit into the collar there with a little bit of stub of the center branch out. There's always minor irregularities like that can happen, and it's a good idea to allow for that, to plan ahead for that. So don't go closer than 1/4 to a 1/2 inch past the growing point you're trying to encourage, and with that nearest point of that cut being on the opposite side of the branch. Saw cutting is a bit different. You will sometimes do some saw thinning, but a lot of times saw cutting is done for heading cuts to cut back larger scale branches. Generally speaking, you can do hand pruners at up to maybe a 1/2 inch, or maybe if you're strong, you got big pruners up to about 3/4 of an inch of diameter of branch. You can use loppers on a really good pair of loppers and with good arm strength, up to maybe 1.25 inches of branch, 1.5 inches of branch, and still get good cuts. Anything much over 1.5 inches probably needs to be cut with a saw. One of the things that happens with saw cutting is that you're doing a fair amount of tissue damage, but you're cutting bigger branches. And what happens is you've got a lot, you're gonna make your cut, but you've got a lot of branch and a lot of branch weight past the point where you're cutting. Now, in theory, you could do several cuts to limit that weight before you do your primary cut, but that's really labor intensive, and a really mature fruit tree might take a couple, 3 hours to prune anyway. So best to avoid making lots of multiple cuts to eliminate weight issues. So what I'd like to see you do is put an undercut. If you got your branch here, figure out where you're making that heading cut. Again, we're trying to encourage specific directions on branch development. And where that cut is going to finish, you want to undercut from the bottom up a quarter to a third up the branch. Not far enough that the branch starts coming down and crimps your saw blade in there so you can't get it out, but enough to give you a nice clean line and to take some of the pressure off. Next, you're going to come down further away from where that final cut will be. 4 to 6 inches down the branch is fine. I'm usually at 2 to 3, but that does depend a little bit on how big a branch too. And do your downward cut like you would normally make a saw cut down from the top of the branch. And when you get something around halfway through that branch from the top and you've already underscored the bottom, it's going to crack and break. And because you've undercut, it's just going to break back to that cut and fall. If you didn't make that undercut first, it's going to break and it's going to splinter and it's going to tear a strip of bark clear back down that branch, leaving a huge wound that may or may not ever heal right. So that undercut is the critical part of that. And you'll make your down cut, you'll let that branch will fall away, you'll take all the weight off, and then you'll have just a little bit of a stub left that's already undercut. Now you can make your matching cut down from the bottom to match up with that undercut. You have no weight on it, and it'll all just cut off nice and clean for you without making any huge wounds that are hard to heal. So it's a 3-step process: undercut, branch removal cut, and then final cut to bring it to level grade. And that will promote good tree health in pruning. Okay, so we talked about a little about what we're going for and how to make the cuts. Evaluation, and this is where it becomes something less of a science and something more of an artistic thing. There's specific steps you want to address because there's definite levels of priority in pruning. We don't want to over prune. In general, we want to keep our branch removal to around that 25 to 30% of the total canopy mass at most. So their first priority is to find dead branches, sick branches, obvious disease signs, insect-infested branches, branches that have received physical injury from storm damage, from branches rubbing together, that kind of thing. And prioritize the removal of those specific problem branches before they develop into bigger problems. So get up into your tree, careful looking around your tree on the outside edge, find the dead, damaged, sick branches and get them out. And then you stop and you take another look. Branches that are either crossing each other or rubbing together at any angle, or branches that if they continue growing the direction they're going are going to hit that situation, which is typically branches that are arching back in towards the center, or branches that are arching between 2 different scaffold branches. These are going to be problems at some point, and there's no sense in encouraging them. So it's a good idea to physically remove them at that stage. Then we're looking at overall shape and productivity. So we'll talk a little bit about tree shapes and sizes, but broadly, we're trying to create an open crowned tree, so an open center with lots of outward going branches that are relatively low to the ground to keep them easy to maintain, and that are thinned enough to be manageable in production. Question in the chat: how can we identify dead branches on an old tree in the winter? One of the reasons we wait as long as we do is by December, trees are dormant, but you can actually see the buds. And dead wood will have shriveled buds, non-existent buds. Live wood will have developing buds. And when in doubt, you might delay your pruning. As we get past the solstice, the later we get, the more we're starting to get small amounts of buds swelling, and it becomes increasingly obvious. Just don't wait too long. Sometimes you'll actually see the injuries. I was pruning an old apple tree on a property we own, not immediately local, one of the ones that took me forever. And I've got huge branches that are partially hollowed out, and some of the branches off of those hollows are dead. We can't take out the hollow branches because we'd have no tree left. This happens to really old trees over a long period of time. But it was distinctly obvious even on mixed batch of growth coming out of near the tops of those hollow branches that some of those branches just are brittle and they have absolutely no viable buds along the length. So that's probably the easiest way is to look at the buds, get a decent look at the buds. There is some experiential aspects to these. You do it a couple of years and you can tell at a quick look, usually if the branch is viable or not. But there's a little bit of learning curve to seeing the buds and understanding what they look like and what's alive or dead. So dead, damaged, and diseased tissue on a young tree here, good for getting up close and showing some examples. So on the left-hand picture there, that stub branch on the top is visibly dead, no swollen buds, discolored, we've got the black coloration, one of the things you learn to look for, and needs to be removed. That branch is completely dead, is no longer viable. It's likely to get infections into that dead wood, which can then invade back into the healthier tissue behind it. Damaged branches. The forefront branch in the middle picture shows obvious signs of physical injury. That may have been a heavy bruise from higher up the tree pruning and dropped a branch on it. It wasn't really noticeable immediately, but over the course of the next year, it developed that callousing tissue. Sometimes diseases can also cause that kind of a callus. It's a canker in that case, but it looks like callus tissue if it's not rupturing and sap oozing. On the other hand, as you can see on the right-hand picture there, sometimes diseases are super visible. In this case of bacterial blight on this poor little peach tree, that branch obviously has to be completely removed, clear back at the branch column. So on this dead and damaged slide, and that's a good question in the chat, the little dead branch on the left-hand branch will probably be just removed right past the black mark, leaving, again, it's a heading cut at this point, leaving the rest of that branch to go on. I hesitate to say that would definitely be the case. It looks like in the picture that that branch that would be remaining behind, while it's viable, may not be going in a direction we want to keep. We might end up pruning further back to encourage a more upward outward bud instead of one that's going straight down to the ground. The rubbing tissue branch, that's a classic candidate for a thinning. It's a fairly substantial branch, at least 3 years old, and we cut it right back to the branch, top of the branch collar where it joins the parent branch there. And the last picture there on the right, you have to cut carefully as close to the trunk as you can without damaging the trunk. Try to keep a branch collar if the branch collar is not visibly infected. If the branch collar is infected, you're ahead to take it out rather than leave it for healing purposes. Good classic case of where you definitely should sterilize your pruners after making that cut. This could be a significant issue. Bacterial blights often are. The question in the chat is, do you include the dead, diseased branches in the 25 to 30% total you're removing? I generally do not include dead wood in the total because it was not producing energy into the tree. I do include diseased or physically damaged tissues into that 25 to 30%. There are some judgment calls. You can prune a third, especially on young trees. Older trees, you want to be a little careful about that. Remember that the harder you prune, the more they're going to try to replace that growth vegetatively, which can cost you yield and can cause you problems to deal with next year's pruning. So err a little bit on the cautious side on those numbers where practical. Okay, so once we've dealt with the real problem stuff, the damage, the rubbing, the stuff that's just getting in each other's way, any obviously diseased or insect infested tissues, now we start developing the shape of the tree. There's a lot of different styles out there. If you go through pruning books, you'll see a lot of different options, and a lot of books specifically will recommend certain pruning styles for certain types of fruit trees. You know, a high central leader on pears, a modified leader on stone fruits, open centered for apples. It does depend not only on the type of tree, but also the rootstock it's grafted on and what's going to fit. It's one thing when you're running a commercial orchard. I think for the average home gardener, most are going to prefer an open centered prune. It brings the tree down into a scale and direction that is easier to maintain, and harvest. Orchardists sometimes have other criteria in yield per acre, and sometimes they will use other pruning techniques. There are advantages to modified leader in particular. in overall yield, but they do become higher trees that are a little harder to maintain. So in general, we're working towards an open center. We'll talk about a couple of exceptions as we get into some of the specialty trees that are different. So some photographic evidence of how this works. So on the left hand is a before picture. That's a really, really, really old apple tree. So Chris Shonnard in the picture there, he's over 6 feet. So it gives you an idea on what your scale of tree is there. You look at the before pruning, and this was actually a really well-maintained tree. If you look at the overall scaffold structure, it was developed well in its youth. It's only got a couple of years of growth that's gotten out of hand there. This is really typically what you're looking at on an old tree that has been consistently pruned at least every year to every other year and has never been severely neglected. So one of the things you're going to notice is there's a whole lot of very vertical growth coming out of the top of that tree, cluttering up the entire center of that tree. That type of growth is called a water sprout. It's a typical response to significant pruning, lots of vegetative growth reaching for the sky. That growth in itself will never be significantly productive wood. It's not growing right to be production wood. It's all going to be vegetative growth. So generally speaking, after you've gotten your disease and your damage taken care of, one of the first things you're going to want to do in shaping is to open that out by taking all of that vertical water sprout stuff out of the tree. It looks totally disastrous when you prune that much, but remember, you've got a lot of finger growth on the outside that you're keeping. But you've got to get those verticals out there. They're nothing but a liability. There are certain exceptions in removal of all verticals. You might want to be considering developing a secondary layer of scaffold branches. In other words, you typically will select your scaffold branches, we'll talk about this in a couple of slides, to have some different elevations, but they're all coming out from basically the same level, developing outward and outward and outward. You're continually developing them outward and then periodically heading them back to rejuvenate. On a tree that's a more vigorous tree or that you're intending to get a little bigger, you might actually want to develop a secondary layer above that with good separation between it, but also going outward and outward, keeping the open center. That can increase your yield at the expense of some additional height. The other thing is you are going to be doing some heading back of old branches over time, as we've mentioned a couple of times. And sometimes you need to find something that's going to go up that you're then going to head to develop that branch after you've cut back the growing tip. So there are definitely reasons where you might keep a small percentage of vertical growth, particularly on the outer periphery of that canopy. But we've got to open that center out. If we don't, we have disease issues. We have poor light penetration resulting in uneven or inconsistent maturation or ripening of the fruit. In addition, you're going to find that you're going to do some thinning on those outer branches. The tree is going to try to produce more fruit than it can actually successfully mature. So letting tons of those finger branches, those finger laterals come out of the scaffolds, develop out is actually a liability. You need to open them out to develop available airspace in between them. So kind of an overview on mature tree, and we'll talk a little bit more about really old trees a little bit later on here. So say you're starting a new orchard, working with a new tree. Your first priorities are to maintain health branch angles, get good clean branch angles, and start finding and selecting the skeleton of the tree, the scaffold branches. The sketch there you see is really typical of maybe a 2-year-old apple tree, typically the size they're sold at. And you notice the current ascending leader. Question in the chat: is it important to leave enough leaves on a tree to protect the trunk of the tree during the summer? Yes, you don't want to butcher a tree completely. You can actually, in a pinch, and it's a disastrous situation where only if there's no other situation, actually remove pretty much everything, stub it. It's called pollarding. We don't recommend it as a pruning technique. It can sometimes be the only way to salvage a really old and really neglected tree. The tree will regrow lots and lots and lots of canopy after pruning. So don't be panicked about it. But don't get down there to where you have all scaffold branches and 2 or 3 lateral fingers off of each branch, and that's all you leave behind. because that is insufficient leaf mass to restore enough energy into the tree. Heavy pruning resulting in heavy lateral growth or heavy water sprout growth, either direction, does weird things sometimes to nutrient balances too. So all that wood you took off and then you burn or whatever you do to get rid of is energy that the tree has absorbed, is photosynthesis energy, but there's also nutrient energy. And one of the things that happens is, especially on plums, apples in particular, sometimes pears, you can strip so much calcium out of a tree by heavy pruning that you start having impact, bitter pit in apples, a classic example. So you don't want to over disastrously prune. You do want to leave a decent mass. If you're leaving 2/3 of your overall canopy intact, you will have plenty of vegetative mass. The trees are going to grow really vigorously after pruning. Okay, so on the smaller, younger trees, we're trying to develop a scaffold branch. You notice you got a central leader up. You normally will do a minimal or no pruning on the central leader the first year at planting time. And it's a little bit of a decision-making process. When you look at that tree, understand that from where that graft line is, that distance up to the first lowest branch, that's never going to get any longer. So you're not likely to keep those first lowest branches, because then that would result in a tree that starts branching at 18 inches or so off the ground. So you're likely to be either heading back those if they're really substantial, or actually thinning those lowest branches out entirely right at planting. Look immediately for any really bad branch angle stuff. A good branch angle should be approaching a 45-degree angle. If you are much more obtuse than that, it becomes somewhat weak in terms of its structural integrity. If you're much substantially less or more acute, less angled than that, you're going to have problems with the development of the branch collar and competition between these two side-by-side branches. So clean out any of the problem stuff like that right away. It's real common to keep that central leader for a year or two and start finding where those branches are going to be. It's also really common to take a little bit out of the top of that leader, just a little, so that the buds down below that pruning cut will start developing, and you start developing some branches that you can then pick from over the next 2 to 3 years to develop the actual structure. A really young tree, a 1-year-old tree, as the question in the chat goes, has just basically a single vertical leader. On most fruit trees, you'll want to create a slight top cut, something around 25% off the top of that, to encourage some branch development down low. And you'll still get something, the next bud down will usually turn right up and become the new leader up. Anytime you do any of those heading cuts on the leader, you do have to pay attention to what the rest of the branches are doing. It's really common after you make a leader stop growing, you'll either get 2 or 3 coming out from below it that are all competing to become the leader, or a lower down branch that was left behind suddenly gets an influx of energy and shoots clear up. And then you have to correct those issues over the next year or two. Nut trees are somewhat different. This applies to fruit trees in general, though. Yes, you want to tip a single leader tree to start developing some branch structure, and 2- and 3-year-old trees, you want to start immediately working the lowest branches up, correcting problem ones, and start developing some upper branches to become your actual scaffold. Generally, we're talking about a little bit harder pruning in youth, maybe 30%. Really tree by tree evaluation. I've seen apple trees that have 2 branches and you're not going to cut 30% off of that. I've seen plum trees that have so much growth that you're taking more than 30% just to get something you can work with. So some judgment calls are appropriate. But yeah, you need to take a fair amount out and start developing that critical shape. This shows a really good progression of a young tree. So we talked about on the first picture there, you can see the kind of removing some of the low branches and trying to find where those select scaffold branches are at. Question in the chat, does this apply to star fruit? Okay, which one is star fruit? As we're going along after that point, You can see the next year how the tree has responded to that growth. And we now have multiple branches developing out from the lower canopy. Oh, carambola. Well, here's the thing. My experience has been in basically temperate climates like the Pacific Northwest. We don't handle any tropical, subtropicals to speak of, and pruning rules are very different for those trees. So I'm sorry, I'm not really able to qualified to answer your question on carambola. And apologize about that, but it's outside of my experience. So as you see that tree developing out, we're going to thin some of those branches to keep the more robust outer developing branches going. We're still heading back and thinning to develop your actual skeletal structure. Over the next 2 years, that skeletal structure should develop. You want to really get your 3 to 4 to 5 branches that are becoming your skeleton. It's important that you select branches that are not joining the trunk at exactly the same spot. If you keep 2 branches that are coming out at the exact same spot on the trunk, those branch collars as you eventually top that tree out to open the center will kind of swell together. And branch collars are wonderful tissues, but they can be also weak if there's a lot of them. And so having 2 or 3 branches all at the same spot invites problems when you get some ice load or some really heavy fruit load, that they can actually just peel apart right down the seam where those 2 branch collars run together. So if you can separate by 6 or 8 inches or more of trunk height where your parent branches start coming out, that will tend to encourage better overall structure in the tree as a whole. Question on the chat is a good rule of thumb that 50% of a tree should be its trunk before the branches begin. So that becomes as much an aesthetic and functional question as tree health. 50% of a tree should be trunk before branches begin. Not necessarily, though that could apply fairly well on a very young tree. It is okay to low branch trees if you want to do that. If you want to be able to reach them readily and you don't mind working them with a bushier habit, you can have short trunks. You'll find that some trees are easy to develop high trunks and then high branch structures on. Pears tend to do that really readily. On the other hand, peaches and nectarines really should be headed back hard and kept branched lower. You're going to be handling them a little bit more, and especially the ripening sequence and harvest, you need to keep them down. So not always an appropriate rule of thumb. It's not a horrible rule if you like getting that much trunk up. What you'll find on a mature tree is it's much less than 50% of the height of the tree is the actual trunk mass. By the time you're into year 4 or maybe year 5, depending on how your development is gone, you should have your 3 to 4 to maybe 5 major scaffold branches developed out and be moving them in an outward spreading direction. And at that point is when you will take out any remaining vertical leader. I did my peach tree at year 3. Had enough branch structure where I wanted it to just take the center out and start developing it outward. That's what we call an open-centered prune. A good guideline as you're getting into that year 4, 5, and beyond maintenance pruning is to stand with your feet at the trunk and facing the trunk and look up. When you're done pruning, you should see sky, not branches, right at the trunk level, with all of your growth in a donut around the outer perimeter of the tree. A classic example of a plum tree at that 4-year-old stage. I hate pruning plums. So you can see that the scaffold on the left-hand side picture there, the before picture, scaffold branches have developed out. Typical of a plum, it really did not keep a central leader in any case. There's no leader to remove at this stage. It's already not there. The branches just bifurcated and went their ways, which is fine. But you see what plums do to you. They produce a ton of small finger growth off the laterals, both the interior set of the laterals and clear on the outside edge, creating this very dense and often kind of flat-topped crown that is just totally congested of branches crossing each other and going every which way. So typical maintenance on this from this year, year 4, and going forward. Maintain those scaffold branches and clear out the center. And you see in the right-hand picture there, the after picture, how much of that center growth came out to keep encouraging this outward forming. A really mature plum tree will end up being wider than tall typically, and will have a lot of its growth there on the outer edges. You notice in the picture too, especially the little branch that's facing directly in towards us. Besides actually taking out the center, we took some of that multitudinous lateral growth out. It's not, lateral growth like that is not bad. There's just too much of it. We took several individual branches out to maintain a reasonable presentation of fruit that's not all going to be crowded together. Plum trees are a nuisance. Peach trees are a bit simpler, all in all. And this, again, gives you a pretty good idea what you're looking at in terms of volumetric removal. It's still a fairly young peach tree at 4 years. Notice the soil's a little wet there. We've got a pretty good scaffold already structured up on it. And so we have a couple of lower branches and then a couple of higher branches, developing a 4-branch scaffold. Lots of interior growth. And so we had to thin a lot of it out. A question in the chat, will the video be made available? It will be posted to our YouTube channel within a few days. It takes us a couple of days to get it edited and submitted up. We have all of our class videos now on our YouTube channel, so do check into that. And yes, this will be on there shortly. So we're opening that out, and again, you can see, especially in the branch immediately towards us, how we've thinned the fingers out. We've thinned the lateral growth out to try to reduce the overall load on the tree, to make sure we have a good amount of leaf mass. But we have some decent fruiting buds, flowering and fruiting buds as well. It becomes valuable as you get your tree developing out to learn to recognize the difference between a vegetative growth bud, a leaf or shoot bud, and a flower bud. Flower buds will typically be larger, rounder. Vegetative growth buds will usually be smaller, pointed, and vegetative growth buds are often adpressed against the parent branch, where your flower or fruit buds will typically be slightly pointed out or pointed away from the branch. You can get into all kinds of fancy evaluation of your percentages of flower to leaf that you're supposed to be leaving on a tree. I've never really had that much of an issue with it, as long as you're doing adequate overall thinning and that you're paying attention that not only not cut out every flower bud, which is easy to do on a young tree, but also not so stripping all the fingers out that you have no vegetative growth, nothing but flower buds behind, because that's stressful to the tree as well. So I said, really typical on developing a younger tree. You can see the development of the scaffolds as they're coming out and the thinning that's going on. And as we go forward on this peach tree, we'll be continuing to produce branches, and heading a lot of these secondary fingers, the more robust laterals off the scaffold branch. We'll be heading them out to produce more spreading fingers out yet, and to continue an outward progression. Peach trees prune short. You can see just how short this is. That first branch is probably 28 to 30 inches off the ground, often higher than I would actually bother with peaches. I often run them shorter than that. Okay, older trees. You see what we're talking about again, the open-centered habit. If you're standing there at that trunk and you look up, all your branches are arrayed in a donut around you, and looking up at sky. We generally prefer this. Now, this is basically an essential pruning method for dwarf trees, dwarf apples and plums, dwarf pears. Even for semi-dwarf, a lot of books will recommend going to a modified leader instead of a true open center. We find that the home gardener really prefers this, and it's actually easier to overall maintain. The response, however, is that sometimes you get a lot of really aggressive water sprouting that you really have to fight. This tends to produce trees that are short, relatively sturdy. They've got relatively good trunk circumference and branch size. There are a few drawbacks depending on the rootstock. Some trees, as you get really old and really broad, you might start getting a little tippy because of the weight issues on the outer edges of the tree. Generally speaking, this is a technique for trees that are being maintained at that 10 to 12 to maybe 15 feet. If you're really going higher than 15 feet on your tree, you probably don't want to do the true open center. You might want to do the modified leader pruning. This makes them easier to continue to prune, makes them easier to spray, and makes them much, much easier to harvest. Even a tree like this at 10 or 12 feet is still going to involve a certain amount of ladder work, but it's reduced and it's down to a 6-foot or an 8-foot ladder rather than a 14-foot orchard ladder, which is a real hazard to work on sometimes. So I'll cover some very basic direction on what we're looking at on fruit trees. It's really challenging to cover this as thoroughly as we like in verbal. I love doing this in person, but it is what it is still for another year or so. We'll talk about some specialty situations. And I know there was a question in the chat a little bit back about multi-variety trees, and we'll hit that in this section here. And then we'll go on to fielding questions. So what we've been talking about here are your traditional Northwest fruit trees. It applies generally to peaches and nectarines, apricots, almonds. It applies to apples and pears, plums, all your really traditional stuff. There are trees that do not prune the same. Notable are fig trees. So fig trees are can be very productive crops here. They really are often very big trees. There are certain varieties that are shorter. They're not grafted. You don't have options of different rootstocks to control your size of the tree. You can choose varieties that stay smaller, but a lot of the full-size varieties are 20 to 25-foot trees in their natural growth pattern. Figs do not produce the same way that an apple tree or a cherry tree does. Figs that are highly successful in the Northwest primarily ripen their breba crop, their early crop. We may or may not ripen the fall crop on everbearing figs, and figs that are only fall crop figs seldom produce well here. The breba crop is simply the little baby figs that set in August or September and have been sitting there out there on the wood all winter just waiting. And then those are the figs that will ripen in the early summer. Typically, a breba fig will actually overproduce brebas. So you will probably need to do some thinning of some. And so that is on the base part of the last year's growth. So the growth that came out last year, you'll find brebas forming down where it came off of the parent branch. So when you're trying to prune a fig, you're going to try to accomplish a couple of things. You're going to try to keep the size under control. You're going to try to open out the center. We still do that. You're also going to thin fruit, and you're going to remove a fair percentage of potential fruiting woods so they don't overproduce. And so one of the things that people do wrong with figs is they try to grow them like an apple tree with a trunk and scaffold branches and out from there. Figs don't really respond really well to that. Try to keep your figs with short trunks, and you can develop scaffolds, 4 or 5 scaffolds, but you're going to find a lot of growth coming into the interior off of those. It's just as practical when you're starting a new fig to make it branch even at ground level. They're not grafted. If you get root suckers, they're still the same tree as you bought, unlike a grafted fruit tree. What we'd like to see is 4 to 5 main branches that can be base level trunks, or that can be a short trunk and 4 to 5 branches. And those branches will be more ascending, trending towards an open vasing shape. When you do them as a really multi-trunk tree, they will typically end up much more rounded and opening out even more. You need to pay attention to the bark coloration changes, because that will tell you what is older wood and what is current year wood. And you'll need to thin about 1/3 to 1/2 of the last most recent season's growth out. Look for brebas while you're doing that. Preserve a reasonable amount of brebas for production, and where you're preserving brebas, head back to just past those little baby figs. Then you'll get the harvest out of those breba figs. You'll get new growth that comes out, and you can, like say, ripen a fall crop, but it's really hit and miss here. We don't have a long enough, hot enough summer for the secondary crop, the fall crop on figs to really mature. And that's a shame, because on most figs, that is the superior crop in terms of yield. Nonetheless, you get a mature fig tree, you'll probably have more figs than you can handle. They are very productive, especially as they hit maturity at that 8 to 10 year range plus. But it's more critical than ever to thin out and open out, and to not keep too much wood. They're very coarse in branch, and it looks like you're leaving nothing behind, but they will produce plenty if you keep them well thinned out. Persimmons, you want to start off generally pruning them in their youth, like a young traditional apple or cherry tree. You want to create a little more space, if possible, between your scaffold branches, because they're not going to really open center out like a traditional fruit tree. What those are going to become is those are going to become kind of heads. Those branches will become kind of stout and somewhat upturned or upright branch structures. So you want to keep some separation of them around the perimeter, but a little more gap between them on the trunk than you would on a traditional fruit tree. You still want to open the center some as they mature. And ultimately what you're going to get is a 4 or 5 branch scaffold, but with well separated and well distributed branches. And you're not going to thin anywhere near as hard as you do with fruit trees. You're just going to take care of your real trouble branches and any really twiggy or weak growth to keep a nice robust series of growing points that are growing on the outer edge. Now, as that tree matures, you're going to find that they stop producing as much vegetative growth and as much fruit on the scaffold over time, and you're going to need to head them back. You can do the whole tree kind of all at once in a heading back, which will cost you usually an entire year's production, or you can go around and take a branch back as it's getting older, and then the next year take the next branch back and kind of do a rejuvenation pruning. As long as you're keeping the center reasonably well cleaned out and your growth going out in fingers off of the scaffold branches outward rather than inward, your production should be good. Pruning as hard as you prune an apple tree will result in 0 fruit whatsoever. So don't over thin and over chop on them. Nut trees are significantly different. I'll take that back. Almonds are basically a peach. If you've ever seen almonds in production, they've set a fruit that's kind of like a soft peach, and then the actual almond you harvest is the pit inside the fruit. And you'll train them a bit more like a more traditional fruit tree. Hazelnuts or filberts, they tend to be bushy, and a lot of the modern varieties are even more bushy than the old varieties. If you're trying to create 3 or 4 branches out, you're going to create a short trunk space. You're not going to have really tall trunks and then the branches starting up. Keep them low, keep them spreading. Like with the persimmons, those branches can develop upright heads. Now, filberts or hazelnuts, you have the option. You can prune to outer buds and spread them a little bit more, and that's an acceptable way of maintaining them. More traditionally, what they try to do is develop 3 or 4 heads, ascending heads again. Thin out the interior, watch the sucker development from the ground level. They're prone to doing a lot of that, and that needs to be removed completely, all those low sprouts from the trunks and root system. Like with persimmons, those heads are going to age out. They're going to lose vigor and productivity, and so they'll need to be rejuvenation pruned. And again, commercially, they handle it one of 2 ways. They can go through and do a whole orchard out and prune everything back. They have no yield the next year, but the next 2 to 3 years after that are so productive that it's worth it on a commercial scale. Or they'll do selectively. They'll do 1 or 2 heads on a tree and then come back through and do 1 or 2 heads on the tree and go around the tree. On a commercial orchard, that can be kind of a pain to do that sequential pruning, and thus you'll see some more of the heading back the whole orchard at once and taking an off year. Walnut trees are definitely more heading, and you cannot really develop a scaffold branch structure on them. A young walnut tree, say it's an unbranched whip, might be 5 or 6 feet tall. Just top it right at 30 inches. Just top it halfway down. From there, you'll get 2 or 3 ascending branches coming up. Those become upright, modified trunks, truly heads. Minimize your pruning on your walnuts beyond that. Thinning out the center is generally good, encouraging some finger development off of those heads to go outward rather than inward, and let them go for 2 or 3 or 4 years. Again, you'll see a decline in vigor. You can head them back, rejuvenate, get another set of branches off of them. But nut trees need less pruning generally than fruit trees, and you don't want to over attack them. Chestnuts are in between walnut and hazelnut. They can be pruned to either characteristic, either as a more spreading, almost fruit tree-like open-centered habit, or a more multi-headed walnut tree habit. People tend to do them a little more walnutty because they are bigger trees. So walnut trees are 30 or 40 feet. Chestnut trees are easily 30. Most of your hazelnuts, 10 to 12 to 15, maybe 20 on the outside for some varieties. So much smaller trees naturally. So nut trees are different. They require a little more of a learning curve because you get used to pruning fruit trees, and the nuts are definitely different. Multi-variety combos. Okay, so once you look at that left picture there, it's a typical upright multi-variety tree like a fruit salad tree. And the owner of that particular tree went through in the season and labeled the branches by just putting color flagging on them. This becomes important because one of the easy things to do as you're getting up there with mature trees of the multi-grafts is it's really easy for either one variety to completely dominate and suddenly become 50% or more of the tree's canopy. Or conversely, you've got a branch that's kind of fighting and it's struggling along. Let's say, well, I'm going to take that out. And you accidentally take out an entire variety because that was the only branch of that variety on the tree. So keeping some labeling on them year over year will help your pruning. Your initial start on a young multi-variety graft is just like anything else, except it's often simplified. You've got your 4 or 5 varieties already cleanly labeled. There's usually 1 or 2 branches of each. You're not going to change those positions on the trunk. You get what you got when you bought it, but you will thin open the centers, and you won't allow a lot of multiple branches coming off of those grafts. Maggie, I see your chat on the citrus. I'll talk about citrus in just a minute. They are substantially different. Again, not usually grown outdoors here, but I can give you some guidelines on them. So it's important that you keep those branches separating from each other instead of intertwining, so you can tell them apart and start developing each of those varieties to kind of go out in somewhat different directions. Each variety becomes a scaffold branch. Label them so you can keep track of them. And pay attention to the difference in vigor. This, even for plum trees or for apple trees on the same grafted rootstock, you'll see substantial differences in how vigorous each of those varieties is. And so you need to prune accordingly so you're neither letting one dominate nor completely accidentally eliminating one. And that's the tricky part of pruning a multi-variety, really, is keeping track of who's who on the tree. Do shop carefully when you're shopping multi-variety trees, because like I say, what you get for branch positioning is what you're going to be stuck with. You can't really fix that. So look for things that have good separation of initial grafts and are well distributed around the circumference of the rootstock. Espalier are a lifestyle. They're not just a prune and forget. This is training trees onto wires or structures to create specific shapes, whether it's a cordon fence like you see in the picture, or an upright fan, or up against a wall, candelabra patterns. You can do all kinds of fun things with these. Not all fruit trees espalier well. Apples are easy. Pears are not super hard, but they tend to fight training pretty aggressively. Stone fruits are a little bit harder to get both the combination of maintaining the structure and shape you want and still maintaining good flower and fruit production. So they can be a little more challenging. Not undoable, just trickier. When you're training to espalier, you can buy trees that are already shaped like that, or you can start slowly bending branches off of a tree to form the shape. Have your structures in place immediately at planting, because you're going to need to start training onto them immediately. Typically, on a young tree, we'll do a little bit of letting them grow and then bringing them back into espalier the next pruning year for a year or 2 as we're developing the actual cordons, only taking out growth that's really going vigorously from closer back to the center rather than heading out all the stuff where it's turning up. But as they mature and they get into production, you're going to have to go throughout the summer and control those vigorous growths coming off every which way off those armatures, so they're not running into the branch above them, and so they're not overexpanding the tree. You want to keep this in kind of rows of cylindrical branches. with leaves on them in a dense canopy, but your fruit towards the outer edge of that. Otherwise, you're going to have this little problem with shading out the fruit, or with so much energy going into branch production that the fruit never really matures. So it's an ongoing pruning through the summer that doesn't go away as they mature. Actually, the need for it increases somewhat as they mature. So they do require more hands-on maintenance over the course of the year, and less just prune them in January and you're done. Citrus. Okay, so citrus, most citrus have a distinctive flowering cycle at the end of a vegetative growth cycle, and then a fruiting cycle, and it's one of each per year. It's typical of, for example, limes and oranges. So depending on what your immediate growing conditions are in your environment, it's real typical for your vegetative growth cycle to be spring into early summer, flowering out summer, fall, fruit ripening fall, winter. Okay. And so you need to pay attention to your season and do what pruning you're going to do at the beginning of the vegetative growth cycle or during the growth cycle if you're trying to restrict some of the more vigorous growths, and then stop, let them finish maturing, regrowing, and maturing, and setting flower buds and going through their flower and fruit cycle. Meyer lemon is a distinct difference. Some of the kumquats are a bit different too. They tend to reflower freely through the season, and you have a little bit more leeway in pruning. Generally speaking, on citrus, you're not going to prune them as hard as you do our traditional Northwest fruit trees, and you're focusing on developing a spreading canopy with a good array of flower and fruit buds all around, arrayed around the perimeter. Never orcharded them. One thing to do them in containers here in the Northwest and bring them in and out. I do know it is a bit different in California. I'll defer to somebody down there for more details on that. But that's kind of the generics on citrus. Their flowering and fruit cycle really limits what you can do in terms of pruning them. So old orchards. Say you've inherited a place and you've got a 40-some-year-old fruit tree that has been neglected for at least 10, and you just don't know what to do with it. This is what we're going to talk about here. I'm going to address the question in chat real quick. Is moss throughout the tree harming the tree, or should it be taken off? Okay, when you see moss in a tree here, it's not moss, it's lichens. Lichens are not inherently damaging. They're not parasitic. They're not taking anything away from the tree. Excessive amount of lichen development can cover over potential buds, preventing them from getting sunlight and preventing them from then developing out as they would. Really heavy lichen growth is often symptomatic of either poor air circulation or poor lighting, but not exclusively. We live in a climate where lichen grows really, really well. In general, small amounts of lichen, not a problem. Intense amounts of lichen can be reduced or controlled through spraying, not through pruning. Copper sprays, oil sprays, lime sulfur sprays all do a fair job of burning lichen off to one degree or another, and you don't need to focus on total removal, just keeping it under some modicum of control. If you go back to the earlier slides in there where you see the saw pruning going on, you see how much lichen development there is on that apple tree. It's perfectly fine. That's pretty normal. We worry about the ability to suffocate buds, and we worry about huge amounts of lichen on the outer edges of the canopy that could accumulate water and then freeze, adding to quite a bit of ice weight. So if it's getting bad, reduce it some, not normally a disaster other than that. Okay, so when you're looking at an old tree, you're going to find some interesting situations. You'll find lots of flaky or chunked off bark, typical on a tree that's been neglected. You need to kind of get in there, pull those off, and see what's happening underneath there. Is that just a minor injury that shed some bark, but the structural integrity is still there? Is that a dead branch? Bark sheds after they die, usually 2 to 3 years after they die. Do we have an insect problem? Is there a disease canker under there that's causing this bark shed? Why is the bark coming loose? But if the structural integrity is otherwise good, we can just simply leave it at that stage. You will find a fair amount of storm damage, breakage, sometimes some actual dead branches of varying sizes. And those are things you're going to have to deal with right away. Severely damaged branches. Lots of sucker growth, possibly from the base, depending on the tree in question, particularly pears and plums. Lots and lots of vertical water sprouting that has gotten so big that they've begun to lateral branch. 2 or 3 years after they go up, they start trying to develop lateral branches. which makes them really hard to thin out effectively. And those kinds of situations. So you're going to have a kind of a fight on your hands, and it's not going to be a one-year fix. It's going to be a long-term project getting that tree back into productivity. So you take the time to evaluate it now. Are you ahead to take that tree out, move over 6 feet, put a new fruit tree in, and realize that you'll have fruit in 2 or 3 years, maybe not to the volume of the old tree, but you'll be back in production, versus spending 2 to 3 to 4 years recuperating this tree? Is there still enough tree there, viable tree there, to make it worth the 4 years? Fruit trees can live a very, very, very long time and can maintain productivity for a century or more. So it very well might be, but sometimes you got a situation where your best choice is simply to start over. So first stage, first year, we focus on real problems, upper canopy stuff. A huge branch that's gone very, very vertical and is 4 inches in diameter, and you know you're not going to keep it, get it out. Broken, badly dead branches, severe injuries, major suckers. Clean out, for sanitation purposes, clean out all weeds and debris and stuff underneath the tree. Carefully, don't injure the trunk, but get it cleaned up. Your second year is now to start opening that center back out. This is where we've already taken any really aggressively growing stuff that's just out of control out of the top, but you've still got a lot of very vertical stuff off of all your scaffold branches, and they need to be headed back to encourage redevelopment of that horizontal growth habit and opening out that center. It's worthwhile at this stage, at year 2, to evaluate some of those scaffold branches and either head them back, or in cases where they're just weird shapes, they're just going to be a problem, physically remove the entire major branch and regrow a new structure to it. Keep under a modicum of control here, 25 to 30%, maybe 33%. That's all you really want to take out at any one stage. You're going to stress them, and you're going to create more problems if you try to bypass the next year's step. Old scaffold branches, consider heading some back if they're getting really cluttery at the end at this stage. By year 3, you've started to develop an actual form. You can start seeing that umbrella donut shape developing. Control problem branches in terms of orientation, and work on developing those outer bud forms. By now, you're starting to get a pretty good finger development out on those outer scaffold branches. You're going to start having to thin those fingers a little bit more aggressively, not let all of them develop. First couple of years of rejuvenating that, most of that finger growth was probably being kept. By year 4, you're back into a more traditional pruning habit. You've developed your open center, you're developing your scaffold. You'll periodically rejuvenate, prune the outer edges to create some new fingers out of there, and you've gotten it down to a size where you can actually continually harvest and maintain it. Sanitation through all these processes is important. Always take your prunings out of the orchard to either burn or dispose of. Don't leave dead wood lying in the orchard. It can be a problem from an insect and a disease standpoint, so get it out from under the trees one way or another. Phew. Okay, so it's always harder to talk about this than to do it. I hope we've covered a lot of the bases for you so you have a chance to understand what you're looking at in tree, and I am available for just follow-up questions at this point. Question, are we able to get a copy of the recording? It will be posted on our YouTube within the next few days, so you can go to our YouTube channel and check it out. We've got a lot of other educational videos on that location as well. Tim, spraying recommendations. Okay, so if for some reason you can't catch my next class coming up, which is fruit tree spraying, we want to do the spraying in the dormant season as well as preventatives. I like using copper as my default go-to fungicide because it does both bacterial and fungal diseases, where lime sulfur does not. The focus on these is disease prevention in dormant season spraying rather than active treatment. So you still want to prune out badly infected stuff. Sometimes with all the pruning and appropriate dormant season spraying in the world, you still have problems. This is particularly true of very disease-prone trees like apricots and peaches, where they have a lot of diseases that spread post-flower. You may need to do follow-up sprays with other types of products. There are organic and synthetic options for fungicides in the growing season that you can use after flower, but while there's fruit on the tree. Do advise you check into the class schedule online. I will be doing fruit tree spraying as my next major class here. Should new trees always be pruned at planting? Okay. So if you are looking at a young apple, pear, peach, cherry, you really need to start developing the form right away. There is some difference between a 1 year, like you buy a little whip, and a 2 to 3 year where you've actually got some branches already, as to how much you really want to chop on them this first year or two. But it is really critical that you develop those branch angles and start selecting that skeleton as early as possible. What happens if you don't? Well, if you just throw the tree in the ground and let it grow, you're going to end up often enough, and sometimes it works out okay, but often enough you're going to end up in a situation where you have two very competing branches at an angle like this going up, trying to be your leader. And now they're not little things like this, but they're like this, and you're going to have to saw cut them, and you've already got this huge area of specialized tissue where the two collars have come together. You've got a weakness. Is that necessarily a disaster? No, but it is a risk. So generally highly recommended you do pruning. We do tend to say that people tend to over prune their baby trees and under prune their mature trees. People really like to whack away at those things when we can reach them. Don't over prune, but take into account what you're trying to accomplish long term. Have a vision in place. Low branches, are you going to keep those? You know, is that knee-high branch really where you want it when you're trying to run a lawnmower under there, for example? Are you going to run a tractor into that? You need to really select a leader and get some height if you're going to tractor underneath your trees. Develop that actual skeletal structure that is robust enough to support fruit load, because there's nothing worse than investing the money in a fruit tree, growing it for 4 or 5 years, and you're starting to get into fruit production and it fails, it splits apart down the middle because it wasn't pruned right. Or you have productivity problems because you have to do heavy pruning to correct earlier pruning mistakes. So yes, generally good idea to prune them young. Question, can we apply the rules of apple pruning to a vine maple that's getting too tall, or create an umbrella-shaped canopy? Okay, vine maples are different. Maple pruning is significantly different. Maples tend to bleed when winter pruned. So we often will do significant amounts of pruning on maples in the late summer to fall to reduce that. Can you develop a trunk, a spreading branch structure, and then a relatively rounded canopy on a vine maple? Absolutely. It takes a little more work than on an apple. They tend to fight it by going very vertical, but it's quite suitable. Depends a little bit on what your vine maple is to start with. If you've got a fairly natural vine maple that's got just this going up and maybe one other one going up like this, you're going to take some tops out the first time, start selecting some branches here and developing them out. You can't just bring it down to where you want it and then select what's left. You're going to need to encourage some bud break. There's going to be pretty good gaps typically between where the branches can come out. With a 10-year-old tree, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. Again, not impossible, but be careful. Limit your pruning. Don't over prune, and prune when they're not getting ready to go through an active growth cycle, because they tend to bleed. Okay. So blow up the chat so I can see more of these at a time. Okay. Copper for spraying. Okay, so there are lots of options for dormant season sprays. The orchard tradition is actually lime sulfur, calcium polysulfide. Calcium polysulfide is a little harder to get in homeowner size packaging anymore due to changes in transportation and regulation, basically. So we don't really get like quarts of lime sulfur that the homeowner can spray one tree with. You go down to your farm supply stores, you can still get 2.5-gallon jugs. Lime sulfur doesn't store very well. Get as much as you're going to use in a season, because it usually precipitates out as a granule over the course of a year after it's been opened, and then it's no good anymore. Lime sulfur is a great fungicide. It's a better fungicide than copper. Copper, however, does bacterial control as well as fungal control. Lime sulfur does not. And that's a real problem here because we have a lot of bacterial blight issues on cherries, plums, peaches, and nectarines in particular. And having that additional control of the bacterial diseases is highly valuable. There are other options beyond that too, but those are the two we primarily run. You can get elemental sulfur if you want a sulfur fungicide. There are several types of copper and choices to be made, varying pros and cons to the different types of copper. Again, I would recommend you catch the spraying class if you get a chance, and there's some more information online with our handouts. As far as other pruning classes, rarely do heading pruning, should prune after bud break. Okay, I do not like to prune after bud emergence. It's not that you can't, but those buds, those emerging flower buds are really delicate. You're likely to bang up a lot of potential fruit production just in the course of doing the pruning. I do agree that we rarely do heading prunes on mature established trees. You do have to do some heading to rejuvenate periodically. It's a fairly standard technique. And you'll sometimes have a branch that you want to keep part of and develop out, in which case you might do a head. For example, you've got a scaffold branch here, you got a lateral branch that's coming out, and you really don't want that branch to keep going that way, but you've got some nice potential finger buds to develop out of that. You might head that back. The vast majority of our pruning on a mature fruit tree is thinning. You're thinning out, doing thinning cuts on all those vertical sprouts, and you're thinning the fingers. You don't do a ton of heading. Young trees, you have to do heading to get the forms started the way you want to go. Question in there too about blueberries. So blueberries are fun. We do have an upcoming blueberry class you might attend as well, but I'll go through the basics. Blueberries have to have really vigorous growth from ground level, which means your soil has to be acidic enough, they have to be receiving enough water, and they have to be receiving enough fertilization. Your goal, your long-term goal on a bush that is, say, 8 to 10 years old in peak of production is to have basically anywhere from 10 to 12 to maybe 15 or so branches from ground level that are very vigorous and nothing older than 4 years old. So the cycle on pruning on blueberries is to remove the 2 or 3 oldest branches every year, keeping the younger stuff growing up. Once you've got those old branches out, then you want to encourage an opening vase-shaped bush, the relatively open center, not as open out as a fruit tree, doesn't need to be that clean, but to allow some light to come through. Branches that are crossing back into the interior should be removed. Weak, twiggy branches that either won't support a fruit load or would actually bend down to ground level with fruit load should be removed as well. Again, then you'll get new growth out. The following year, you'll take the 3 or 4 oldest branches out and continually rejuvenating that crown. The hard part is if you haven't been doing that already, what are your old branches? Well, pay attention to this year's growth and fruiting cycle. Branches that have tons and tons of fruit with relatively few leaves are candidates for removal the next year. They're actually taking more energy out of the plant than they're putting back in, and that's what happens if you don't thin them like that. Okay, is there a rule of thumb about cutting above or below a flower bud versus a vegetative bud? In general, when we're talking about heading cuts and bud positioning, you're cutting past a vegetative bud because you're encouraging growth. Different sometimes with some of the spur fruiting plants. Rules are meant to be broken sometimes. But in general, we're talking about vegetative growth. You're not usually pruning back to specifically flower buds. Usually you'll find a vegetative bud or two that you're actually trying to head back. Thinning cuts are different because you don't pay any attention to what buds are adjacent to the thinning cut. Now you're just removing whole branch. Yeah, the old pears are a real challenge because they really like to push vertical, and you're going to fight that for a little while. Apple trees produce pruning twice a year, and once a year at the end of summer. So, Helen, it really depends on where you are. We do the vast majority of our pruning, structural pruning, now between early December and maybe the end of February, first part of March. It's really common to go through and do a second pruning. This may involve thinning fruit. This may involve doing some additional water sprout or sucker removal, or otherwise opening out the crown in the mid to late summer. So this is at the end of the vegetative growth cycle. It's usually late June or early July. And that's real common. In other climates, it's common to do your major pruning in that cycle, in that summer cycle. And there's nothing wrong with that. Don't do really late pruning in August, September. Again, more for her, you have to adapt that to your specific climate. What risks happening is if you are at that transition post fruit and you prune, you might get a vegetative push that then freezes. Regardless, it's not going to result in quite the tree response you would if you just waited until they were completely dormant, or if you did it earlier, right at the end of their vegetative growth cycle. Okay, Helen, UK is not that much different from the Pacific Northwest, all in all, except you're probably, unless you're in Scotland, much less likely to have the freeze damage issues. Twice a year pruning on mature fruit trees is totally common. Very few. Okay, so you may have to worry about temperatures then in Scotland, just like we do, to some extent. So twice a year pruning on mature trees is totally common. Trees tend to overproduce if you prune them as recommended. It's really important to do the thinning of pruning, if nothing else, where you get up there before the trees are trying to really actively mature. This is why, again, June is a really good guideline for most fruit trees. It's a little different for cherries, of course. Don't let too many fruit mature. Don't let pears that are touching each other mature. Take one out. Don't let apples that are growing in a cluster mature. Thin them down to basically one apple per growing point with no physical contact between the fruit. This becomes a real problem in I say, mature trees. It's also really common to have really vigorous response growths after pruning, and it's a good idea to do some of that thinning, because they won't do the same thing. They won't respond with that vigorous vegetative growth in summer prunings. Good tropical trees guidance. I don't have anything completely ready for you on tropicals. I would contact the California Rare Fruit Growers, crfg.org, for tropicals and subtropicals. They may not have enough on their website for you, but this is what they do. They talk about handling fruits that are rare even in the California climate, which includes a lot of tropicals and a goodly chunk of the more esoteric subtropicals. And that would be a great starting point. They are experts in those unusual fruits. Okay, looks like I have no more questions pending in chat. I want to thank you all for attending. It's been fun. I am always welcome to take additional questions so you can give me a call here at the nursery. You can shoot me an email, Darren, D-A-R-R-E-N, @shonnards.com will get to me, and I would love to have more questions and answer them.